Look at yourself right now. Really look. How many times today did you respond immediately to a message that didn't deserve your attention? How many times did you say yes when your soul screamed no? How many times did you explain yourself to people who never questioned their right to demand explanations from you? You think you're being kind, responsible, caring, but Jung would look you dead in the eyes and tell you the brutal truth. You're not being virtuous, you're being controlled. Every immediate response, every automatic yes, every rushed explanation is a confession of your slavery. You've been programmed since childhood to believe that your worth is measured by how quickly you respond, how available you are, how willing you are to drop everything for others. But this isn't love. This isn't kindness. This is psychological conditioning that has turned you into an emotional vending machine. People insert their needs, press your buttons, and out comes exactly what they ordered. Your time, your energy, your peace. And you call this connection. You call this being needed. You call this love. But Jung saw through this delusion with surgical precision. This constant availability isn't making you valuable, it's making you invisible. Because what is always there becomes wallpaper. What never says no becomes powerless. What explains itself constantly becomes pathetic. You've confused being accessible with being important, and that confusion is destroying you from the inside out. The most devastating part, you don't even realize you're being manipulated. You think these people need you, depend on you, can't survive without you. But watch what happens when you become unavailable. Watch how quickly they find alternatives. Watch how easily they replace your function with someone else's immediate response. Because they were never connecting with you, they were connecting with your availability. They weren't loving you, they were loving what you provided. And the moment you stop providing it, you discover the terrifying truth. Most of your relationships are transactions disguised as connections. You've become so predictable that people don't even have to ask anymore. They just expect. They expect your time, your emotional labor, your constant presence. And you deliver like a well-trained performer who's forgotten their acting. But every time you respond without thinking, every time you prioritize their urgency over your peace, you're signing another contract of enslavement. You're agreeing to be less than human, to be a function, a service, a convenience. You think you understand manipulation. You imagine its obvious threats, violence, dramatic scenes. But Jung knew better. The most effective manipulation is invisible, dressed up as need, wrapped in the language of love, delivered with tears in their eyes and desperation in their voice. These energy vampires don't attack you. They don't even argue with you. They simply position themselves as the crisis that requires your immediate attention, the emergency that justifies destroying your boundaries, the victim who needs exactly what you're foolish enough to give. Watch how it works. They text you at 2 a.m. with their urgent problem. They call during your peaceful moments with their dramatic revelations. They show up uninvited when you finally found some silence. And what do? You respond. You engage. You sacrifice your energy on the altar of their manufactured crisis. Because they've trained you to believe that their emotional state is your responsibility, that their comfort matters more than your peace, that their need for attention outweighs your need for solitude. But here's what Jung understood that you haven't grasped yet. These people can sense your energy signature from miles away. They know exactly when you're feeling guilty, lonely, or desperate for purpose. They know when you're most vulnerable to their particular brand of manipulation. It's not coincidence that they reach out precisely when you're questioning your worth, when you're feeling disconnected, when you're hungry for meaning. They're psychic predators, and you're bleeding energy so profusely that they can smell it through the digital ether. Every time you respond to their manufactured urgency, you're teaching them that your boundaries are suggestions, not laws. Every time you drop everything for their crisis, you're confirming that your priorities are negotiable. Every time you explain why you can't help instead of simply saying no, you're opening the door for them to negotiate their way back into your energy field. You think you're being compassionate, but you're being trained. You think you're helping, but you're being harvested. The cruelest part is how they make you complicit in your own exploitation. They never explicitly demand your availability. They just create situations where your unavailability would make you feel guilty. They don't ask for your energy. They just position themselves as so desperately in need that only a monster would refuse to help. They don't steal your time. They just create urgencies that make saying no feel like abandoning someone in crisis. And you fall for it every single time, because nobody taught you that compassion without boundaries is just elaborate self-destruction. You keep giving because you're terrified of being seen as selfish, cold, or uncaring. But what you don't realize is that by being available to everyone, you've become valuable to no one. Your energy, once precious and rare, has become as common as tap water. Your attention, once focused and powerful, has been diluted into meaningless interactions with people who will never value what they didn't have to earn. You've become so accessible that you've made yourself invisible, so helpful that you've become taken for granted, so understanding that you've been relegated to the emotional garbage disposal of everyone else's problems. The moment you discover the power of silence, you become dangerous, not to others, to the illusions that have been controlling your life. Silence isn't the absence of response, it's the presence of choice. And choice, Jung understood, is the most revolutionary act a human being can perform. When you stop reacting automatically, when you refuse to dance to someone else's emotional music, when you choose silence over explanation, you're not being passive, you're being sovereign. But let's be brutally honest about what happens when you first attempt this. The world will not celebrate your awakening. The people who have grown comfortable with your predictable responses will panic. They'll escalate their demands, intensify their manipulation, create bigger emergencies to trigger your old patterns, because your silence threatens the very foundation of their psychological control system. They can handle your anger, your frustration, even your rejection, because all of these are still reactions. But your complete absence of reaction, that terrifies them. This is where most people break. They can't handle the discomfort of being misunderstood, the anxiety of not explaining themselves, the guilt of letting others suffer in their own self-created drama. So they rush back into the familiar patterns of over-explanation, immediate response, and emotional availability. They choose the comfort of slavery over the uncertainty of freedom. But you're going to be different, because you understand what Jung meant when he said that individuation requires the courage to stand alone. Silence is not cruelty, it's clarity. When you stop filling every pause with words, when you refuse to justify your decisions, when you let others sit with their own discomfort, you're creating space for truth to emerge. You're forcing them to confront their own internal noise without using you as a distraction. You're making them face the very thoughts and feelings they've been avoiding by keeping you constantly engaged in their external drama. The power of strategic silence lies in its ability to break projection. When you don't respond the way they expect, when you refuse to play the role they've assigned you, their entire narrative about who you are begins to crumble. They're forced to see you as an independent being rather than an extension of their needs. And for many people, this is the first time they've ever been confronted with your actual humanity rather than your function in their life. But here's what you must understand. Your silence will be interpreted as aggression by those who have grown dependent on your reactions. They'll call you cold, distant, changed. They'll accuse you of not caring, of being selfish, of becoming someone they don't recognize. Good, because the person they thought they knew was a performance you were giving to earn their approval. Your silence is simply the end of the show, the final curtain on a play you never auditioned for but somehow found yourself starring in for years. When you finally master the art of strategic unavailability, something miraculous happens. Not immediately, the transformation takes time. But slowly, inevitably, the people around you begin to change. Not because you're trying to change them, but because your absence forces them to confront parts of themselves they've been avoiding by using you as an emotional crutch. Your unavailability becomes a mirror that reflects their own emptiness, their own neediness, their own unhealed wounds. The energy vampires are the first to reveal themselves. Watch how quickly they disappear when you stop feeding their psychological hunger. The people who only contacted you during their crises suddenly find other sources of emotional supply. The friends who only called when they needed something mysteriously develop the ability to solve their own problems. The family members who treated you like an unpaid therapist discover that their issues weren't actually that urgent after all. Your absence doesn't create these revelations. It simply stops concealing them. But here's where it gets interesting. The people who truly value you, who see you as more than a function, who respect you as a complete human being, they don't disappear. They adapt. They begin to appreciate the time you do give them because they know it's chosen, not compelled. They stop taking your presence for granted because they've experienced your absence and understand that access to you is a privilege, not a right. Your strategic unavailability doesn't push away genuine connections, it reveals them. Jung called this process individuation, but what he was really describing is the magnetic power of wholeness. When you stop desperately seeking connection and start choosing it consciously, when you stop being available to everyone and start being present to yourself, you become irresistibly attractive to psychologically healthy people. Because wholeness recognizes wholeness. Authenticity calls to authenticity. The integrated person becomes a beacon for other integrated people, while simultaneously becoming invisible to those who live in emotional chaos. Your unavailability forces others to develop their own emotional regulation skills. When you're no longer there to absorb their anxiety, they have to learn to sit with it. When you're no longer available to solve their problems, they have to develop their own problem-solving abilities. When you're no longer willing to be their emotional dumping ground, they have to find healthier ways to process their feelings. Your absence becomes a gift, the gift of forcing them to grow up. But this transformation isn't comfortable for anyone involved. The people who have grown dependent on your emotional labor will experience withdrawal symptoms. They'll rage, manipulate, guilt trip, and eventually grieve the loss of the role you used to play in their dysfunction. And you'll have to watch this process without rushing in to make it easier for them. You'll have to resist the urge to explain, to comfort, to return to your old patterns of enabling their emotional immaturity. Because true love sometimes looks like letting people face the consequences of their own choices, even when those consequences are painful to witness. Here's the truth that no motivational speaker will tell you. The path to psychological freedom is paved with loneliness, real loneliness, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, the kind that strips away all the external validation you've been using as psychological medication, the kind that forces you to sit with your own thoughts, your own fears, your own inadequacies, without anyone else there to distract you from the work of becoming whole. Most people run from this solitude like it's a disease. They'll accept any relationship, no matter how toxic, rather than face the silence of their own company. They'll maintain friendships that drain them, romantic partnerships that diminish them, family dynamics that destroy them, all because the alternative, being alone with themselves, feels like death. But Jung knew better. He understood that this solitude isn't punishment, it's initiation. It's the sacred space where you stop being a reaction to others and start becoming a response to your own authentic nature. When you finally choose unavailability, when you stop being accessible to everyone else's emotional emergencies, you enter this sacred solitude. And it's terrifying, because for the first time, possibly in your entire adult life, you're forced to confront who you are when you're not performing for others. You discover thoughts you've been avoiding, feelings you've been suppressing, dreams you've been sacrificing on the altar of other people's expectations. You meet yourself, perhaps for the first time, without the distorting mirror of external approval. The weak cannot handle this encounter. They'll break their own boundaries, abandon their hard-won solitude, and rush back into the comfortable chaos of being needed, wanted, used. They'll convince themselves that isolation is selfish, that boundaries are cruel, that their peace is less important than other people's comfort. They'll create elaborate justifications for returning to their emotional slavery, because the freedom of authentic solitude is more terrifying than the familiar prison of constant availability. But the strong, those rare individuals who have the courage to sit with their own souls, discover something revolutionary in this solitude. They discover that they don't need external validation to feel worthy. They don't need constant stimulation to feel alive. They don't need to be needed to feel valuable. In the silence of their own company, they find a peace that no external relationship can provide, a strength that no external approval can enhance, a completeness that makes them irresistible to others precisely because they no longer need anyone else to complete them. This is the paradox that destroys weak minds. The moment you stop needing others, they start needing you. The moment you become unavailable, you become valuable. The moment you choose solitude over slavery, you become magnetic to those who recognize authentic power when they see it. Your aloneness isn't isolation, it's sovereignty. Your unavailability isn't rejection, it's selection. Your silence isn't emptiness, it's fullness so complete that it doesn't need to justify itself to anyone. In this sacred solitude, you finally understand what Jung meant by individuation. You stop being a collection of other people's expectations and start becoming your own authentic creation. You stop seeking yourself in the eyes of others and start finding yourself in the depths of your own soul. You stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself so completely that the very act becomes an invitation to others to do the same. This is where we separate the men from the boys, the authentic from the performative, the free from the enslaved. The moment arrives when you must choose your peace or their comfort, your boundaries or their expectations, your authentic self or their projected image of who you should be. And this choice, this singular moment of decision, will determine whether you live the rest of your life as a free man or continue existing as an emotional servant to other people's dysfunction. Most people never reach this moment because they've never questioned the fundamental assumption that other people's feelings are their responsibility. They've been so thoroughly conditioned to prioritize external harmony over internal integrity that the very idea of choosing themselves feels like betrayal. But Jung would tell you that the real betrayal happened long ago, when you betrayed yourself by accepting the role of perpetual accommodator, when you sacrificed your authentic nature on the altar of other people's approval. The moment you choose unavailability, the moment you decide that your energy is precious and finite, the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who never earned the right to an explanation, that's when you discover what it means to be truly alive. Not reactive, not responsive to every stimulus, not dancing to the rhythm of other people's needs, but sovereign, self-directed, authentically, unapologetically yourself. But let's be clear about what this costs. You will lose people, good. The people you lose were never really with you anyway, they were with the version of you that served their purposes. You will be misunderstood, excellent. Being understood by people who live unconsciously is not a compliment, it's a warning that you're still operating at their level of awareness. You will be called selfish, cold, arrogant, difficult, perfect. These accusations are confessions from people who have grown comfortable exploiting your boundaries and are angry that the free ride is over. The weak will tell you that choosing yourself is selfish, but Jung understood that self-betrayal is the ultimate selfishness because it forces others to relate to a false version of you. When you prioritize their comfort over your authenticity, you rob them of the opportunity to know and love your real self. You force them to invest in a performance that will eventually end, leaving them feeling deceived and you feeling exhausted. True generosity requires first being true to yourself, because you cannot give what you do not have, and you cannot have authenticity while living as someone else's idea of who you should be. This is your moment of truth. Will you continue to live as a slave to other people's emotional needs, or will you finally claim your rightful place as the sovereign of your own existence? Will you keep explaining yourself to people who have no interest in understanding you, or will you embrace the revolutionary power of needing no one's permission to be yourself? Will you remain available to everyone and valuable to no one? Or will you become selectively available and infinitely precious to those who earn access to your authentic presence? The choice is yours, but choose wisely, because once you taste the freedom of unavailability, once you experience the power of conscious solitude, once you feel what it's like to be whole within yourself, there's no going back to the prison of constant availability. You'll never again mistake being needed for being loved. You'll never again confuse being chosen for being valued. You'll never again sacrifice your peace for someone else's comfort. And in that moment of choosing yourself completely, you'll understand what Jung meant when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who they want you to be, not who they need you to be, but who you are when no one is watching, when no one is demanding, when no one is expecting anything from you except the radical act of being authentically, courageously, unavailably yourself. This transformation isn't just personal, it's revolutionary. When you choose unavailability, when you model what it looks like to prioritize your own peace over others' comfort, You give permission to everyone around you to do the same. Your boundaries become an invitation for others to examine their own lack of boundaries. Your self-respect becomes a mirror that reveals their own self-abandonment. Your refusal to be used becomes a catalyst for their own journey toward wholeness. You don't just save yourself. You become a living example of what psychological freedom looks like, inspiring others to break their own chains of emotional slavery and step into the terrifying, exhilarating reality of choosing themselves over the crowd's expectations.